Good day, and thank you for joining us. This session will focus on finding the best possible product portfolio using portfolio optimization techniques to maximize portfolio value along the efficient frontier. My name is Michel Delifer. I'm on the left side of your screen, and I'm a sales and marketing director at Planisware. I have been in the field of PPM for approximately 17 years. I am delighted to introduce our featured speaker, thought leader for today, Dr. Richard Bayney. His very impressive bio states that Dr. Bayney is president and founder of Project and Portfolio Value Creation, a consulting boutique providing training and education in project, program, portfolio, resource, and risk management, as well as client services in strategic, business, and portfolio planning. He is also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania and a frequent speaker on the above topics in the US, Europe, and Asia. Dr. Bayney is widely regarded as a thought leader and equally important as a practitioner of portfolio management best practices. Since 2008, he has implemented several important processes and methodologies that have enabled organizations to realize a multitude of project and portfolio benefits. In his last corporate position, he was Vice President and Head of Decision Analysis and Portfolio Management at Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceutical Research and Development. For those who may be interested, Dr. Bayney will be presenting a Project Portfolio Management Masterclass with optional certification this coming February 2nd and 3rd at the University of Pennsylvania. And it will be sponsored by the Planisware Center for Excellence. For today's webinar, Dr. Bayney will focus on the topic of how to find the best possible product portfolio, how to find the right mix of projects to achieve maximum ROI. These days, many organizations use some sort or combination of project prioritization, scoring or ranking techniques. And it is said that sometimes they fail to capture the best possible portfolio value, and they leave money on the proverbial table. Dr. Bayney is going to take us through how to maximize those investments, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Bayney, who will take us through his very insightful presentation. Dr. Bayney.
So, Michelle, thank you very much for your very kind introduction as always. To those of you on the webinar, I wish you a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. Now, in the context of today's title, Finding the Best Possible Product Portfolio, there are 5 agenda items I'd like to cover with you. First and foremost is to look at an overarching orientation to portfolio management in the context of the attainment of strategic and financial goals without violating your resource constraints and respecting your risk preferences. The second item is to look at some foundational definitions of portfolio selection by project prioritization and portfolio optimization. Now, unfortunately, I hasten to add that the term portfolio optimization has been widely used and misused, both within the literature and, in fact, at a number of very popular conferences. So I'd like to take you through those foundational differences today so that at least we have a common understanding of what I mean by project prioritization and what I also mean by portfolio optimization, and they are not necessarily one and the same. Now, at the end of the second agenda item, I will have a polling question, which will be facilitated by Michelle. Next, I will describe the economic efficient frontier. First of all, in its financial context, and that is really the historical birth of the efficient frontier. Next, to extrapolate from the financial industry to the R&D industry to see where it is very much applicable. And third, to describe the necessary prerequisites for conducting portfolio optimization along the efficient frontier. Now, with all of that good theory in mind, I will then bring that to life with a case study of a notional company called Great Products Are Us. Clearly, there is a portfolio management need and problem. That is, this organization has too many good assets and insufficient resources to pursue every asset. So during the course of this case study, I'll look at a comparative analysis of value destruction caused by inferior portfolio selection and how to avoid that by seeking to optimize the value of the portfolio that you have along the efficient frontier. Then lastly, I will discuss some of the seminal challenges that are involved in the implementation of superior portfolio selection techniques such as portfolio optimization in all types of organizations, with a specific emphasis on successful organizations. So to the first agenda item on portfolio management. Now before we start a discussion on prioritization and optimization, my belief is that it is most important to ensure that there is integration between strategic and financial goals at the enterprise level on a time-dependent or temporal basis. Clearly, that strategic alignment needs to ensure that that is first and foremost in the portfolio selection for any type of asset, project, a program, or a sub-portfolio. Next, the value maximization. Whether you're maximizing financial value or any other type of value, we're clearly trying to maximize the outcome of our investments. The third is temporal balance, and that refers to the ability and willingness to make trade-offs between short-term gains, medium-term gains, and long-term gains. For example, one may be willing to forego short-term top-line growth over the next 5 years for the benefit of investing more into R&D with the hope and expectation that one can maximize longer-term growth. The counterpoint to that is one may need to forego longer-term growth because there is a compelling need to maximize short-term growth or short-term value creation. So these three pinnacles, by the way, are essential for the integration of good portfolio management. Now in that context, there needs to be an interdependence between strategic planning, portfolio planning, and business planning. And what I mean by that is that when we think about and we engage in the discipline of portfolio management, my humble recommendation is that we should always start with corporate goals. They essentially define the multi-period plan according to the strategic intent of the organization. Now with those corporate goals in mind, and they can be financial goals, strategic goals, or any other type of goals, then one needs to try to create an actionable portfolio strategy that essentially determines where and how to compete in accordance with those corporate goals. Next, in accordance with the portfolio strategy, one then needs to create an R&D and business investment strategy that ensures there is the appropriate allocation of resources to best fulfill the needs of the portfolio strategy. Now these three plans ought not to exist in splendid isolation. Far from it. There should be a great degree of interdependence between them, and what I mean by that is the following. It is easy to start out with corporate goals and develop a portfolio strategy that is supported by an investment strategy. But what happens if one or other goal actually changes over the course of time, as indeed it often occurs? Then the portfolio strategy needs to respond seamlessly to a change in corporate goals. That portfolio strategy can only become actionable if in turn it is actually supported by the R&D and revised business investment strategy. The converse is also true. Change doesn't always have to occur at the very top of the pyramid. Let's assume that it's a very tough financial year and it is decided that as opposed to a prior budgetary constraint or limit that was set, there is now a need to constrain the budget even more. Well, clearly your portfolio strategy has to change to support a reduced budgetary constraint. With that in mind, the corporate goals now need to be amended to account for the fact that the portfolio strategy has changed because the R&D and business investment strategy has changed. So I hope that with this little pyramid I've been able to depict the necessary interdependence between the strategic plan, the portfolio plan, and the business plan. Now let's turn to some of the foundational definitions of portfolio selection by project prioritization and portfolio optimization. Prioritization clearly is a widely used methodology that is utilized to rank order projects and sometimes programs, but let's try to keep this a little simple, to rank order projects within a portfolio. Now, in its best definition, it really is a methodology that utilizes one or other quantitative or qualitative metrics or attributes or decision criteria to generate a rank order of projects, and that's why I've underscored these words. It is also a state of the level of urgency or importance of a project that depicts essentially its rank order. Therefore, it is a right to precedence. Now, in this case, let's assume that there are 4 projects in someone's portfolio. These are ranked on the basis of NPV. Now, clearly on the basis of NPV, one would say that we ought to pursue project E before D and before J and A and any of the others. Then, after having done project A, or at least initiated project A, we should then go to D and the rest follows. Now, that is really the fundamental basis on which rank ordering of projects or project prioritization was essentially done. With that in mind, unfortunately what's happened is that the process of determining where the constraint line lies, as depicted by this dashed line here, the dashed red line, that has become a very popular methodology by which projects are selected to be in or out of the portfolio. Now, in this case, a company could decide that because the constraint line is here, that the projects in green, as I've shown above the line, are the ones that are doable, meaning those can be afforded by the limited budgetary or other constraint. But the projects below the line can't be afforded because that would actually force us to exceed that constraint. So rank ordering has actually become a portfolio selection methodology. Very popular, incredibly widely used, and everyone has, for example, a scoring model. Whether that scoring model is done on a financial basis only using, for example, top-line sales growth, net present value, gross margin, internal rate of return, or a qualitative attribute such as strategic intent or strategic positioning. These scoring models are widely utilized to determine the rank order of projects and one or other metrics, and then this line is drawn to determine where the portfolio accessibility basically ends or is cut off. Now, in stark contrast, portfolio optimization is a very, very different methodology. This is a technique that is often used to maximize value or minimize cost within a portfolio of projects and programs. So, this methodology is oriented towards finding the best combination of projects. Nowhere in here have I stated rank order. There is no rank order within an optimal portfolio of projects and programs that fulfills specified objectives such as maximize net present value, constraints such as the budget, and requirements such as a number of SKUs or a number of new products that need to be launched annually. So it is essentially a system that makes the most use of an economic good, for example, a budget under specified conditions. Now, this green concave curve here is the efficient frontier. Now, there are 3 portfolios that you see here. The blue triangle lies below the efficient frontier. The red and the blue stars lie on the efficient frontier. Now let's first take a look at the blue triangle. That is called an inefficient or a sub-optimized portfolio, in this case portfolio A, which is also known as a prioritized portfolio. That's a bit of a misnomer because we don't really prioritize portfolios. This is really a portfolio of prioritized projects, as we saw 2 or 3 slides ago. Those are the 4 green projects above the line. Now, why is that inefficient? Why is that a suboptimal portfolio? Well, let's examine a specific resource level and call it X. Now, for the same level of resource, that is X, there exists a very different portfolio, portfolio C, that lies on the efficient frontier that is both efficient and is optimized. That is an efficient portfolio, that is an optimal portfolio. The delta in value between portfolio C and portfolio A, which is Y, is the value that, in fact, any organization could unintentionally destroy or forego because it never searched for it. So, by using, in fact, an inferior portfolio selection methodology such as prioritization, one would yield this blue triangular portfolio, which is a good portfolio, a feasible portfolio, quite an actionable portfolio, but one would never know just how far away from the optimal portfolio one could actually get to, that is, the value destruction denoted by Y. Now, similarly, if one were pursuing a specific value or portfolio reward, let's call that Z, there exists a portfolio that is again optimal and efficient, let's call this portfolio B, that is a better portfolio than portfolio A. Why is that? For the same level of reward, that is Z, portfolio B requires much less resource, that is W, as opposed to portfolio A that requires a much larger amount of resource to yield the same value of Z. Now, in the lexicon of economics and in fact in financial terms, both portfolios B and C are known as dominant portfolios because they dominate portfolio A, which is in fact by definition an inferior portfolio or a dominated portfolio. So I hope I've been able to describe appropriately why it is that portfolios that lie on the efficient frontier are optimal and are efficient, whereas portfolios that lie below the efficient frontier, and there could be a plethora of portfolios that lie below the efficient frontier, are indeed inefficient or suboptimal. Now, where is optimization utilized? Is it just in the financial industry? Absolutely not. That is where it does have its historical roots, but it's also used in the manufacturing industry widely. Salesforce, you can think about resource allocation both for advertising and promotion or sales and marketing. Used by logistics, think about UPS and FedEx every day. And of course it's used in the R&D community as well, pharma and biotech, medical devices and diagnostics, consumer packaged goods, and agriculture. So these are simply 5 examples of where portfolio optimization is utilized very, very routinely. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to ask a polling question. Given the definitions of project prioritization and portfolio optimization, when you assist your organization in actually conducting its annual portfolio review process, what is your portfolio selection methodology by your governance committee? Now, is it by A, portfolio optimization, or is it B, project prioritization? Now, I'll give you 30 seconds to simply vote, after which Michelle will give us the results of the vote. Please take your time.
Okay, Dr. Bayney, we have the results. 81% say that during their annual portfolio review process, the governance committee select the portfolio by project prioritization. That's 81%. And 19% do it by portfolio optimization. Please give us.
Thank you, Michelle. So this is not a surprising result to me. In fact, Michelle, as you know, I have conducted several of these types of benchmarking surveys during masterclass processes and have found numbers that are quite similar to this, so this does not come as a surprise to me, but clearly with roughly 20% doing portfolio optimization and the other 80 doing project prioritization, there is certainly room for discussion regarding how much value could be unintentionally left on the table because these organizations may not be looking for the optimal portfolio or may not be aware that there is such a thing as an optimal portfolio that could exist. Now, before I move on to the next section, Michelle, may I ask if there are any burning questions from anyone in the audience, in which case I'd be more than happy to spend a minute or two addressing those questions.
We've received several questions, and actually I'd like to remind the audience that if we don't get to your question today, we will keep a log of those questions and reply to them as soon as possible following the webinar. But the first question I received, Dr. Bayney, is, without revealing the names of your clients, which companies have implemented this approach? What results did they see, and how long did it take for them to see the results?
So the four primary industries across which I have actually consulted over the past 9 years, and I've worked in pharma and biotech for 23 years prior to that. Those industries are pharma and biotech, medical devices and diagnostics, consumer packaged goods, and agriculture. Now, I've been able to implement portfolio optimization methodologies across all four of these industries. The timeline for their implementation can vary significantly. Now, the fact of the matter is that the more successful the organization, the more refractive that organization generally is to change. The smaller the organization, and especially if their backs are literally against a wall and they're looking at trying to extract the maximum value from their portfolio given their constrained resources, whether those resources are manufacturing capacity, budget, or functional human resources, those are the ones that generally respond and actually react much faster. There's a lot of training and education that's involved, and that can take anywhere from 6 to 12 months, during which the implementation actually takes place in year 1. Now, it is important for me to stress that implementation is not a one-shot deal. Quite frankly, this is a multi-period, multi-year deal in which the capability maturity level of an organization in portfolio management needs to be carefully assessed and brought along with the appropriate tools, techniques, methodologies, and appropriate software.
Dr. Bayney, do we have time for another question now, or do we keep them for another transition in your presentation?
We have time for one more question, and then I will move on.
Okay, I'm going to select one here. How could the efficient frontier work for organizations pursuing a reward that is inherently unquantifiable, such as mission fulfillment, example with a nonprofit?
This is an excellent question. Now, my thesis is that everything is quantifiable. Now, I believe that what the individual who posed the question may have meant is if the reward is not financially quantifiable. So not everything needs to be financially quantifiable. We can quantify everything in terms of its usefulness or its level of goodness or attractiveness, and in that case, the common measure of currency becomes a util. This comes from utility theory and is no longer a financial value. So later on in the presentation, I will turn to utility to just try to extrapolate a little more on that question, but for now, my best response is that A, everything is quantifiable, and B, if it's not financially quantifiable, then we can always find a way to quantify it in terms of its utility, and then we can still try to maximize utility, though it may be a nonprofit or a not-for-profit organization.
Thank you, Dr. Bayney.
All right, thank you, Michelle. So with that, I will move on to the third item, to provide a historical context of the economic efficient frontier. Now, this was introduced by Dr. Harry Markowitz in 1952. The efficient frontier actually describes financial investment portfolios where for a given level of risk as measured by, for example, a standard deviation of return, there is a combination of financial assets that maximizes the return of that portfolio that can't be bettered in terms of its return, in which case that is an efficient portfolio or an optimal portfolio. Now clearly, as I've stated earlier, there are several inefficient or suboptimal portfolios that exist below this frontier. Now by way of extrapolation and R&D for a given level of resource, for example a budget, there is indeed an optimal combination of assets, projects and programs that maximizes the return of that portfolio. Once again, much like in the financial industry, several inefficient portfolios exist below this optimal portfolio. And I hasten to add, as I've described earlier, a vast majority of portfolios that are selected by prioritization are indeed rather inefficient. So this is the concave economic efficient frontier that you've seen earlier. What happens along this curve is that for any given level of resource or risk, but let's stay with resource for now, there does exist an optimal combination of projects and programs that lies along this efficient frontier. The challenge then for all organizations, in my view, is to try to get as close to or on the efficient frontier as possible and to ensure that you are maximizing value, however it is defined in financial terms or in non-financial terms, that is in terms of utility, as opposed to pursuing what may be a good but not an efficient portfolio, in which case there is more than a wastage of resources. There's simply an inefficient use of the resources or the constrained resources that are indeed available. Now the three prerequisites of all optimizations are the following. One must have clearly quantifiable objectives. Generally, it is higher to maximize a benefit, for example, NPV or strategic intent. One can also minimize risk, cost, or time, and that's again a business objective. Now I hasten to make mention of the fact that the pursuit of a single objective allows a solution with the highest value of that objective to be found. Pursuing multiple objectives does not allow you to gain the best value on any single objective. So, for example, if an organization wishes to pursue top-line growth as the only objective, then one is assured of getting 100% of that top-line growth. Once you mix top-line growth with gross margin and net present value and any other financial metrics, for example, payback period, then one can no longer attain 100% purity on any one of those objectives. So we need to have decisions, obviously, that are related to an allocation of resources. Then please note that one is allowed to make a phase-specific go decision on a project that doesn't necessarily have to predicate that all future phases require a positive go decision as well. We need to have constraints that can either be fungible, for example, budget, or non-fungible, for example, manufacturing capacity or functional specialty. So these can be hard constraints or soft constraints. There may also be a need to include an obligatory business need, for example, a project. In any recommended solution, that is also an example of a requirement. So now that I've discussed the context of the efficient frontier, let me try to bring this to life in terms of a case study of a notional company that's called Great Products for Us. Now what we're going to do is to examine the difference between portfolio value creation, which you generally accomplish through project prioritization, and portfolio value maximization, which you always accomplish through portfolio optimization. So we will do a comparative quantitative analysis between those two selection methodologies based on net present value, while at the same time tracking the ROI as defined by the net present value divided by cost. Now, this is a simple table. It's a representation of a company that simply has a problem of riches. What I mean by that is that it has too many projects that it can afford to pursue. Now, if the organization had sufficient budget for all 10 projects, then in fact it would require close to $2.6 billion. Unfortunately, it is constrained by $1.5 billion, so it must make some decisions regarding which projects it ought to pursue, that is, which projects are in the portfolio and which are excluded from the portfolio. Now, if the organization were able to pursue every project, it would yield roughly $6.3 billion with an average ROI of 2.4. Now let's do what roughly 80% of the audience would do. Do a very common sense prioritization on the basis of NPV until we run out of budget. Note that project E rises to the top because it has the highest NPV, as we saw from the previous slide, and project H has the lowest NPV at 375. So what we would do conventionally is to move down this rank order of projects until such time as we ran out of budget. We actually do so immediately after project A. That is why the 4 projects above the red line are in green, meaning we can pursue them. The 6 below the red line are in red, and we simply can't afford to pursue those 6. Now, what does that do for us? Well, that yields a portfolio with an aggregate NPV of nearly $3.2 billion. That's certainly very good. And it also yields a portfolio with an average ROI of 2.2. Now, no one could disagree that this is a good portfolio. Yields a lot of value, and it has a pretty decent ROI. The question is this the best that we can do given the constrained $1.5 billion that we have of budget? Well, let's try a different approach. Let's take exactly the same data from the slide that you saw, the tabular slide with all of the projects, cost and NPV. And now let's throw it into an optimization frame. So now let's optimize the portfolio in NPV until we run out of budget. Note, what does the optimizer do? It actually deselects these 3 projects that are depicted as zeros in red. And now it selects 7 projects in green, which are depicted by 1s. The yield in value is now nearly $4 billion. The difference between 3.195 and 3.995 represents a staggering $800 million, or 20% of the portfolio value, that would have been unintentionally destroyed if Great Products R Us did not look at a different methodology called portfolio optimization to try to select the best value maximizing portfolio. So here we get close to $4 billion with an average ROI of 2.8. Now please remember, before I get to the next slide, what I said earlier. There is no priority within an optimization frame. But in the next slide, I've simply recreated the prior slide that looked at the prioritizations, where the top 4 projects that were selected were in green. Here, portfolio optimization, because it pays no heed or no respect to the priority of a project, deselects 2 of those top 4 projects. Now, why would it do such a thing? The reason that it deselected projects E and J is because it found a better combination of projects moving down the line that increased value without violating the $1.5 billion in budget. This, again, is not a prioritization. This is an optimization that is shown in a prioritization frame. That's all that it is. So what would you advise Great Products R Us to do? Would you advise the company to prioritize projects yielding $3.195 billion with an average ROI of 2.2, or would you advise them to actually optimize the portfolio yielding nearly $4 billion, a 20% increase in value, and an average ROI of 2.8. Now, I feel very confident that the vast majority of you would be looking to the right side of this graphic to determine that portfolio optimization would be the better choice, simply because it yields greater value, and all that I did was use the same data and threw it into a different methodological selection. So how do we explain the superiority of one method over another? The prioritized portfolio A, that is a portfolio of prioritized projects, creates value. There is no question that it does. However, both portfolios C and B actually maximize value. You'll never know if you've been able to maximize the value of your portfolio unless you adopted or implemented a portfolio selection methodology that is based on optimization along the efficient frontier. Once again, south of this concave efficient frontier lie a number of potentially feasible portfolios that are all suboptimal or inefficient. Now, generally, I get some countering arguments from potential clients or at conferences when I ask them, so now that you've seen portfolio optimization versus project prioritization, what would you prefer, and would you adopt this into your organization? And I get a plethora of comments. First, no way in hell. This is far too complex and management will never buy in. We use common sense and good judgment. Well, I've nothing against common sense and good judgment. Nothing, by the way, is far too complex for anyone to understand. It simply needs to be broken down into bite-sized pieces, and the proof of the pudding is in showing the value. Next, data and priorities change far too quickly to use a framework like this. I do not subscribe to that. Data and priorities do not change that quickly. If the data and priorities are good enough to be used in project prioritization, then my thesis is the data and priorities are good enough to be used in portfolio optimization. The same contention I have for the third one, the data and information are too imperfect to use in these types of analysis. That clearly says to me that the imperfect data and information are good enough for project prioritization, but not quite good enough for portfolio optimization. That, I hasten to add, I do not buy into. The next that I generally get is, we're not yet ready for this type of discipline, or we're restructuring again. And I hear that over and over, especially in large and successful companies. The last one that I get is, we're different. We don't make decisions on NPV only. We use strategic and other criteria and good judgment. Back to the first question, or rather the second question that was posed to me by Michelle. Once again, if you don't use a financial metric to determine the value that you're trying to maximize, we simply replace NPV by utility. So that will account for strategic and other criteria. So we simply use utils as the common currency or the common denominator, and we're still trying to maximize utility, not financial value. So to the last section of the discussion, and we're doing well in time, the challenges of implementing superior portfolio selection techniques in successful organizations. Now, every technique has its strengths and weaknesses. The same applies to portfolio optimization as it does to project prioritization. Here I've chosen 6 of the major features of both techniques to describe them briefly. There is no question that optimization searches for the best combination of assets that is possible due to your resource constraints. Prioritization does not. This is a simple rank ordering going top to bottom until you hit your first resource constraint. Next, optimization does quantify value that could be left on the table from doing or engaging in any type of inferior portfolio selection. Prioritization does not. Third, prioritization does not allow you to easily account for project dependencies. For example, if you pursue project A, there is a technical or a commercial dependency on product B that can easily be handled by optimization using binary integer logic in Excel that is not attainable in prioritization easily at all. Now, in my experience and having done both of these for close to 2 decades, within the context of live portfolio reviews, it is much, much easier to do scenario analysis by portfolio optimization through the use of one of our best friends available, that is Excel, rather than doing it by prioritization. This becomes very, very cumbersome when executives start chopping and changing their needs and wants regarding which projects should or should not be in the portfolio. That's much easier to handle using an optimization frame. Now, it is true that optimization does carry some baggage, that is, the perception of being technically burdensome. Prioritization does not. Now again, the way I counteract that is through training and education. And in every organization, whether internal to that organization or external to it, I have engaged in lengthy training and education sessions that have gone all the way up to the highest levels of senior management. That is where the best type of implementation of portfolio optimization occurs, because those techniques need to be inculcated within the DNA of the organization, and that does not come easily. Lastly, it is clear that project prioritization using scoring models is much easier to understand and implement than is portfolio optimization. But if I were running a company, and indeed I run my own very small boutique, my intent is to extract the greatest value from what I can do. So it doesn't matter how difficult it is that I need to understand something, that is my obligation to understand and implement rather than be satisfied with the value that I can create. My intention is to maximize the value I pursue. Now, unfortunately, everything seems to have a hint of politics with respect to all forms of decision making. That does not mean that every decision is tainted with politics, far from it. But politics does play a role in portfolio selection in fact, in every organization I've been to, or in fact have worked for. And here are just a couple of the sentiments I've heard expressed around the table. We've been successful for a very long time. Just look at our stock price. We must be doing right, so why change anything? That goes hand in hand with, if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it. Third, the numbers are already shaky, so why complicate matters? Next, senior management will never understand this type of analysis. That may be true unless you undertake the responsibility to ensure that they are as well educated as you are. They don't have to become practitioners of portfolio optimization, but they certainly have the capability to understand it if they have the capability to make multi-million-dollar decisions. You know who will be most upset if we don't select and prioritize their projects? Yes, but that comes at a price. When you engage in inferior portfolio selection, you destroy value. You at least have an obligation to show the value that you could forego by selecting inferior projects to the portfolio. Recently, I've heard this one. We're a green, yellow, red company, not a 1-0 company. There are many thoughts that I have around this. Next, value left on the table. If no one quantifies it, who will ever know? Well, at some point in time, some of you who are on the line may come to run your own companies. If you do, then I believe your mindset will be quantify value that we could be leaving on the table, and if no one's quantifying it, then make sure that I do, because I need to ensure that I'm not leaving value on the table. Last of all, everyone needs to establish priorities so that people know what to work on. Portfolio optimization does not prevent you from establishing priorities. But if those priorities are established, then they should be established within an optimal frame. That is, within the pursuit of the optimal portfolio. Now, change management is never easy, but I do have a recommended solution. Now, sadly, telling successful companies how much more successful they will be if they change their habits can be quite a Sisyphean task. Rather, I prefer to tell successful companies how much less successful they will be if they don't change their existing habits. And I've shown that that can be quite an eye-opener. Though the mathematical expectancy is the same, the only difference is whether you look at it positively or negatively. That is a very telling statement, and that is a consequence of the prospect theory, well described many years ago by Kahneman and Tversky, that basically describes our mindset in the way that we enjoy winning, but we hate losing. So if we pose the problem in the context of what could be lost, we generally gain attention rather than posing the problem in terms of what can be gained. So in summary, there are lessons that I've learned along the way in trying to maximize portfolio value in several organizations across multiple industries. The first is find a senior decision maker who stands to gain by what you do or lose by what you don't do. Next, conduct a pilot project with last year's data and demonstrate the value lost by not trying to maximize financial portfolio value, that is, both top and bottom line value. Third, secure endorsement and visible support to build necessary changes to portfolio processes and selection methodologies. This requires a comprehensive portfolio review plan with specific details regarding who is providing what to whom and by when. This includes a lot of training and education, as I've mentioned earlier. Please note that a necessary prerequisite is to ensure there is data vetting and validation. There are several organizations I've seen that spend a lot of time buying very expensive and very good portfolio management software, but not paying sufficient attention to the pedigree of their data, and these software systems easily mask the poorness of that data because they generate some really glossy, multicolored graphics. Lastly, conduct your portfolio review and document your lessons learned. Now, no one really likes a decision that comes from a software program, so kindly do not tell your executives the model says. Rather, sell your analysis and recommendations as though you are decision enablers. You don't have to have decision rights to enable a decision to be made, but you have to be able to sell your recommendations smartly. Lastly, prepare to move your organization up the capability maturity curve. There is no need to stand still just because you feel as though you're successful. The question is, for how long do you think you can maintain or sustain that level of success? So that comes to an end, the formal presentation. What I'd now like to do, Michelle, is turn it back over to you in the remaining 8 minutes we have to see if there are any further questions before I spend a minute or two describing the content of the 1.5-day portfolio management masterclass that was described by you in the opening section.
Dr. Bayney, thank you. There are actually several questions that came in, but I'm going to quickly select one or two in the time remaining here. Here's a quick one. We thank you for the counter arguments. We are a mid-sized CPG company with a strict R&D budget. Are there any special caveats we should consider when implementing this? Is there a streamlined version of this technique?
So there's a streamlined version to every technique. There is a portfolio framework that I've described in my textbook that's called Enterprise Project Portfolio Management, which I'll be showing a couple slides from now. That framework has worked very, very well for me and for my clients over the past 10 years or so. My recommendation is take a peek at the first 7 chapters of the book and see if you can extract enough from the framework. The framework is called CREOPM, C-R-E-O-P-M. That is a good framework to actually look at a scaled-down version of this. There are no special caveats for CPGs. CPGs have the same fundamental problems as every other industry has. The only things I've noticed with CPGs is you have a plethora of projects that far exceeds those that you find in many other organizations such as pharma and biotech or medical devices and diagnostics. But the methodology actually works better for you because Now, let's say you're a J&J or a P&G and you have multiples of hundreds of projects. How can you do that selection from simple prioritization? That is not something that's easy to do. Portfolio optimization can really become a friend to you if you apply it smartly. If you need to contact me after this webinar is over, then I'm happy to provide you with some good conceptual guidance. Next question, please, Michelle.
This one came up when you talked about optimizing. You can optimize using one criterion, but if you use several values, then you won't have the maximum optimization for all the values. So
that is correct.
Here's the question. I believe the question popped up when you were talking about that, so I'm just relating to it. It says, can we use this technique and still balance the different segments in our portfolio, such as innovations, line extensions, and must-dos?
Yes, you can. Now, the way to do that is to start with a base level of resource commitment. By base level, I mean a threshold below which you would destroy the integrity of any one of those, let's call one of those units platform technologies. Then you engage in a healthy competition at the margin, and the best way to do that is to steal plus or minus 5%, plus or minus 10% from each one of these business units to look at the marginal increase or decrease in value until you hit the threshold. Now, this is a problem that I come across in, for example, pharma and biotech that has multiple therapeutic areas. The question I'm posed is, we have X. We're not going to give X to one of these therapy areas, nor are we going to divide X by the number of therapy areas. So what is the solution? The solution is to start with the basal threshold below which you would destroy every therapeutic area. Then you engage in competition at the margin, and portfolio optimization can be an incredible friend to you in finding the best way to balance across all of those therapy areas or across all of those business units, including technology platforms.
I'll go to the next one, and this possibly could be the last one. It's more of a comment, I believe, rather than a question. It says, optimization does require reliable risk and NPV metrics, and those are not always available.
So that is correct if you're doing optimization under risk and uncertainty. So let's, first of all, remove risk and uncertainty. There is the NPV. You would prioritize on the basis of NPV, so why not optimize on the basis of NPV? Now let's incorporate risk and uncertainty. You have uncertainty in the NPV, meaning you have a range of NPVs. You have risk. Technical risk, operational risk, regulatory risk. Now we go to a stochastic optimization that I have not described here. That is a further level of detail that requires a slightly more careful approach, but the modeling efforts are exactly the same. And what do I use to do the modeling? Your good old friend Excel. Software powers the Excel model and essentially gives you the best possible solution. This is not an issue of finding the optimal data. It's an issue of utilizing the best data, no matter how imperfect it actually is, to the best of its ability to create the greatest value. Now, if as you go along, you learn more, then you refine the risk, you refine the uncertainty. Yes, I accept that perhaps at the beginning of the cycle of a project or a program, you're shaky with your NPV assessments, you're uncertain about the risk, you use the best data that's available. Run the optimization, it'll give you a better outcome than prioritization, and as you learn more as the project matures, then you refine those estimates.
Dr. Bayney, I believe we need to move to the next section, and we will reply to those questions that have not been answered via email. So if you'd like to tell us about the webinar, about the actual masterclass that you will be conducting on February 2nd and 3rd, or give us an overview of the agenda for those two-day masterclass.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. So this is, in fact, a 3-slide description of a 2-day project portfolio management masterclass. where certification is is optional. Yes, I will be your instructor. This is going to be held February 2nd and 3rd next year at the University of Pennsylvania. Those of you who participate in this will obtain a complimentary copy of my textbook, Enterprise Project Portfolio Management, in which I mentioned the description of the CREOPM, the CREOPM Portfolio Management Framework. Now on day one, we begin with an overview of the masterclass to get a sense of your goals or objectives and the impediments to decision making regarding portfolio management in your organizations. We begin talking about decision making under risk and uncertainty. So the last question you posed, Michelle, was quite apropos. Next, we go to CREOPM itself, which is the portfolio management framework that I created several years ago. That sets the stage for looking at cutting-edge portfolio optimization and project prioritization. Now within the masterclass, this is a very hands-on masterclass where you build your own optimization models in Excel, and you use Excel add-in software that drives the Excel models, and you obtain your optimization results, and you can do a lot of playing around and what-if scenario analysis. My favorite technique that is described in my textbook for project prioritization is MODA, or Multiple Objective Decision Analysis. That is a technique that has been fabulously well described by more than a handful of very, very good practitioners long before my time, and all that I've done is to actually massage it slightly and applied it to project prioritization within the 4 industry sectors in which I do most of my work. We end the day with a Q&A discussion on optimization and prioritization within the CREOPM framework. Now, for those of you who would like to come back the next day to take the certification exam, we spend the first 90 minutes looking at portfolio management capability maturity models. Why is this important? It is really important for you to be able to diagnose the current state of your organization's portfolio management capability levels, to look at a future desired state, and just as important, to help create transition plans to enable the organization to move from its current to its desired state. We then have a 30-minute portfolio management multiple choice exam that's followed by a 90-minute case study where you utilize the same techniques that you learned well the day before using Excel and the software that's provided to be able to conduct the exam. We spend the last 15 minutes doing a review of the certification exam. Now, the first day is intensive. The second half day is no less intensive. There's a lot of hard work, but we do have a lot of fun, and we engage in a lot of war stories about what's working in our companies and, more importantly, what isn't. That's probably why many of you show up, and all in all, the reviews have been excellent.
Dr. Bayney, thank you very much for giving us an overview of the agenda of the masterclass. And to the audience, I'd like to close this session first by thanking Dr. Bayney for a fantastic, fantastic webinar. We are at your disposal for questions. You can send questions to the email that will show up at the end, or you can also send it to excellence@planisware.com. The email is listed on the screen. Please stay tuned for the link of the recording that will be sent to everyone who registered and attended this event. Dr. Bayney, thank you very much, and to everyone who attended today, good day.
So thank you all.